In London, it looked like it was going to be a boring and stifling day with rain all day long, but finally the expected rain began to fall. As large raindrops fell on the windshield of Jimmy Butler's latest model electric Jeep, he continued on his way down a narrow back street. The phone signal was growing weaker and weaker until it finally disappeared completely. He was trying to find shortcuts he didn't know to make it to an important charity event in Coral Gables, but the shortcut was starting to get rough, and now he was faced with an even worse situation. Before continuing with the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video for more stories like this. Now I'll leave you with the story. As the engine made noise, he muttered to himself. Then there was silence. No, 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 no. Jimmy hit the steering wheel and tried to start it again. Nothing happened. It was completely broken. Jimmy took his phone. There was still no signal. The rain grew heavier. In the distance, amid the gray mist, a small light flickered. Open. He squinted. A low brick building stood at the edge of the trees. Old, out of place, with a rusty sign, Morris Auto. It looked like it hadn't changed since the 70s. Jimmy opened the car door and ran into the rain, pulling his hood over his head, his sneakers slapping against the wet asphalt. When he entered the garage, it smelled of oil and nostalgia. Tools hung from pegged boards. A single light bulb swayed in the breeze. An old man with oil stains on his overalls looked up. His hands were rough, his back slightly hunched, but his eyes were blue, sharp, and experienced, fixed on Jimmy. The man wiped his hands on a worn rag. "Can I help you?" he asked. Jimmy wiped the rain from his face and said, "Yes. My car broke down on the way here. The engine made a noise and then stopped. I have no cell phone signal. I'm late for an important appointment. Can you take a look?" The old man didn't hesitate. "My name is Frank. I used to fix cars even before they had computers. I'll call a tow truck." Jimmy raised his eyebrows. He wasn't used to being treated like an ordinary person. Most people either recognized him or acted like they didn't, staring at his shoes or his face. But this old man, Frank, seemed completely unfazed. It felt good to Jimmy. Together, they hooked the SUV up to Frank's old tow truck. As the tow truck pulled the luxury vehicle into the garage with a loud, laboring but steady noise, Jimmy began to think. Inside, everything looked preserved. It was as if time had stopped. An old coffee machine, worn concrete floors, faded classic car posters, trophies from old car shows, gathering dust. Frank got to work without fanfare, opened the hood, and hooked up a bulky diagnostic device. Jimmy waited, unable to stay still. "You can use the phone in the office," Frank said without looking up. "The landline still works." Jimmy blinked. "The landline?" Frank grinned. "It's the only line that won't leave you stranded in the rain." In the small office, Jimmy called his team. Help was on the way, but it would be an hour. He sighed and returned to the garage. Frank was frowning at the scanner. "The timing chain is broken. A few valves went with it." Jimmy grimaced. "That looks bad." "Yeah. You're lucky it didn't ruin the whole engine. It'll take at least 3 days. The parts for this model aren't the kind I have on my shelves." Jimmy brought his hand to his face. "How much will it cost?" Frank did the math in his head. "Parts, labor, $2,200. Jimmy shook his head. "All right. I have no other choice." Frank furrowed his brow. "Where did you last take it in for service?" "The dealership. In Tampa." The old man grumbled. "I figured as much. Someone botched the job. They installed the wrong tensioner parts. That's what caused this breakdown." He lifted the damaged parts with both hands to show them. Jimmy looked at them. "They took $800 from me." "Welcome to the modern car service," Frank muttered. "Get it done quickly. We don't have time to do it right." Jimmy looked around again. The place was old, yes, but it was a real place. A horn sounded outside. His car had arrived. "I'll call you tomorrow to check on it," Jimmy said, handing him the card he'd taken out of his pocket. "And for everything, thank you." Frank just nodded. After Jimmy left, Frank remained in the quiet shop. The silence grew even more intense. This job would pay the bills for this month, but what about next month? Places like this couldn't stay open for long anymore. As he began to close up the shop, the dizziness returned. This time, it was worse. He tried to stay on his feet by holding onto the workbench, his chest tightening, everything around him spinning, colors blurring. his breath catching as he felt everything go black. His last thought before he fell was, "I haven't finished yet." When Frank opened his eyes, the white lights on the ceiling hurt his eyes. Everything was blurry. When he opened his eyes a little more, he noticed the spotlights on the ceiling and the regular beeping sound coming from the monitor. There was someone next to him, a tired but familiar face. Sarah. "Dad," she whispered, her eyes moist but her voice calm. "Thank God." Frank swallowed. His throat was dry. Sarah handed him a glass with a straw. "Take a sip of water," but slowly. After drinking, he asked in a hoarse voice, "What happened?" Sarah answered without looking away. "You had a heart attack. If Mr. Peterson hadn't found you, we wouldn't be talking right now." Frank stared at the ceiling. His mind was still focused there, thinking the following. "The car. It's in the garage. Still waiting to be repaired. It wasn't finished." Sarah shook her head. "Dad, you came back from the dead. The car can wait." But Frank turned his head slightly to the right. "It can't wait. I promised. A man's word is his bond. He must finish what he started." Sarah was used to his stubbornness. She turned and took the key to the red toolbox from the drawer. "I'll call Eddie, your apprentice. He owed you money, and now it's time to pay." Frank forced a smile. "He just needs to adjust the timing. I put the chain on, but I couldn't finish it. The timing is delicate." The next morning, when Jimmy Butler returned to Morris Auto to pick up his black SUV, he stepped into the garage, but Frank was nowhere to be found. Eddie greeted him, his hands still covered in grease. "You're Jimmy, right? Frank's last job. Here's your keys." Jimmy paused for a moment. "Where's Frank?" The lines on Eddie's face deepened. "He had a heart attack last night. Luckily, Mr. Peterson stopped by and called an ambulance, but it was a rough night." Jimmy looked at the keys in his hand. He started the car. The engine ran smoothly, but something was missing. This wasn't just about a car anymore. "Is he at the hospital?" he asked. "No," Eddie said. "His daughter Sarah brought him home. He's resting." Jimmy shook his head and took a few steps back. There was only one thought on his mind. "This man isn't just a mechanic to me. He taught me something from the past." That day, Jimmy got into his car and drove away in silence. But the unease inside him drowned out the sound of the engine. A week later, Jimmy Butler was back in front of Morris Auto. This time he had something in his hands, a large black gift basket. Inside were specialty coffees, fruit drinks, dark chocolates, and a few magazines he thought the old man would enjoy. But when he stopped in front of the garage, something was different. The open sign was no longer lit. The windows were closed, and the inside looked empty. Jimmy looked inside through the window. The warm smell of oil and nostalgia had been replaced by silence and empty shelves. A truck was parked behind the garage. Men were going in and out, tearing things off the walls and carrying away the counters. Jimmy gripped the basket a little tighter at the sight. Then someone approached him. A woman in her 40s, he thought. Tired and sad, but trying to stand tall. Her facial features resembled Frank's harsh lines. "Can I help you?" the woman asked. Jimmy replied, "I'm looking for Frank. He fixed my car. I came to thank him." The woman softened her face and smiled. "I'm his daughter. Sarah, nice to meet you. My father, unfortunately, he can't work anymore. The doctors were very clear. His heart couldn't withstand another heart attack. This garage was his life. But now," she looked away from Jimmy, her eyes filled with tears. Jimmy cleared his throat. "I don't just want to thank him. I'd actually like to help him in some small way." Sarah hesitated for a moment. Then she nodded. "He's still trying to recover, but if you'd like, I can take you to him. Follow me. It's only 10 minutes away, at our house." As Jimmy got into his car, he began to feel something. This was no longer just a matter of repaying a debt. It had become a matter of keeping a legacy alive. Jimmy followed Sarah in his car, as if he had known her for years. When they arrived at a simple 2-story house in one of Miami's suburbs, he noticed children's toys in the yard, a worn swing, and a sedan parked on cracked concrete in front of the house. Sarah opened the door and invited Jimmy in. "He's inside. My father is a little better today, but he's still tired," she said in a low voice. "Let's not tire him out, okay?" Jimmy nodded understandingly. "I didn't come to tire him out. I came to listen to him and thank him," he said. When he entered the room, Frank Morris was sitting in a chair. He was covered with a plain gray blanket, and on the table next to him was a half-finished model car, an old screwdriver, and silence. When the old man fixed his eyes on Jimmy, he smiled with a tired but happy expression. "Mr. Butler," he said, his voice hoarse but warm. "Is the car running well?" Jimmy smiled slightly. "When I heard the engine, I thought of your magnificent hands, so skilled from years of experience. So yes, it's great." Frank nodded. "I was sure of that, and I was already relieved. But then why did you come?" Jimmy sat down, put the gift basket aside, and was silent for a moment as he looked around. "You gave me a feeling that went beyond the car. You didn't just do a job. You reminded me how meaningful and priceless a job well done is." Frank blinked proudly and humbly. "I just did what I was supposed to do. Just my job," he said. Jimmy clasped his hands on his knees and began to speak. "My world is very fast. Everything is flashy, digital, and temporary. But what you do is not like that. It's permanent and real. I also know that you're aware that this isn't just you, but that you're one of the last of a generation who do their work the way it should be done." Frank sighed and said sadly, "That garage was my life, Jimmy. 53 years. I lived with my hands. But now I'm too old and sick to keep going with my hands." At that moment, Jimmy leaned toward him and looked at him with determination. "What about with your mind? With your knowledge? What if you had the chance to keep your legacy alive without losing your garage? What would you think?" Frank raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked, "What do you mean? To establish a school, a real place of education, one that bears your name, the Morris Automotive Education Center, an institution where you can pass on your craftsmanship, attention to detail, and work ethic to young people. The legacy of people like you will live on. The next generation will not be technicians who mindlessly replace parts, but hard-working technicians who truly see their work as a profession." Frank was silent for a long time. He looked at his hands. "I'm not a teacher or an instructor, Jimmy. I'm just a real master who turned his work into a profession and does it with genuine passion." At that moment, his daughter Sarah, who had been listening to the entire conversation from the doorway, decided it was time to intervene and stepped inside. "You're wrong, Dad," she said in a determined tone. "You raised Eddie, and many others. You taught them. You may not have realized it, but you've been doing this for years." Frank noticed the happiness in his daughter's eyes and looked into them. Then he turned to Jimmy. "All right, let's say I accept. How will this happen? Who will support us?" Jimmy leaned back proudly and confidently. "Me. I have the connections I need. Sponsorships, donations, even government programs. With your skills and my name, no one can say no. But first you have to decide and say yes." A shadow fell over Frank's face. Then he thought for a moment, and a slight smile appeared. "Now, is what we're talking about real, Jimmy Butler? Or is it just the emotional moment of an NBA star?" Jimmy replied seriously. "This isn't about paying a debt, Frank. It's more than even a thank you for me. It's about living in this world, even if just a little bit, in a way that's right and honest." Frank bowed his head. "All right, Jimmy. I accept your offer. Let's give it a try. But there's one condition." Jimmy looked at him curiously. "A condition? His name will be Morris, because no matter how much this garage changes, it's still my home." Jimmy smiled. "It's a deal, Master Morris." That day, in a quiet living room, a new venture began with a handshake between an NBA star and an old master, and 6 months later, it became a reality. What was once a nostalgic, dilapidated auto repair shop, struggling to stay afloat, now stood before them with a shiny sign, renovated floors, and a brand new, yet timeless appearance. Morris Automotive Training Center. The weather was clear and beautiful on opening day. The sky seemed to be celebrating this new beginning with its sparkling clarity. The crowd began to gather. Journalists, local officials, car enthusiasts, former customers, and new students. Everyone had come to witness the continuation of this transformation. Jimmy stood in the back rows of the crowd, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the old garage's new look. When he saw Frank standing just below the sign with a fancy pair of scissors in his hand, he felt a warmth deep in his heart. His eyes filled with tears. That man was no longer just a master mechanic. He was a mentor, He was now a symbol that represented a brand. Next to Frank stood his granddaughter Emily, his daughter Sarah, and behind them, his first students of various ages. Some were young people who wanted to learn car repair, while others were enthusiasts who wanted to tinker with classic cars in their retirement. Frank turned his eyes to the crowd. His hands were still shaking a little, but this tremor was no longer from weakness, but from the excitement of the lessons he was about to teach. 6 months ago, he began. He continued in a determined tone. This place was about to close. When my heart stopped, it wasn't just me. The garage had stopped too. But then a man, his voice trembling slightly, walked in just when we needed him most. His car had broken down, yes, but in reality, fate had knocked on my door. Today, this training center will continue to stand, thanks to him. The crowd turned around at the same time and looked back. Jimmy bowed his head slightly, looking a bit embarrassed and ashamed. Here, it's not just cars that are repaired, Frank continued, but knowledge, skill, and hard work as well. The place we're opening today not only honors the past, but also builds the future. He raised the ornate scissors into the air. The crowd held its breath, excited and impatient. Morris Automotive Training Center is now officially open. He closed the scissors and the ribbon was cut in two. Applause rang out. The children joined in with whistles. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Emily held her grandfather's hand tightly. Jimmy was still standing in the back, proud and happy. As the crowd dispersed and rushed inside, a hand touched his shoulder. He turned around. It was Eddie standing behind him. Eddie smiled slightly. You know, when I first heard that Jimmy Butler was going to be a sponsor, I honestly thought it was just for publicity. NBA stars do things like that, right? For the cameras. Jimmy narrowed his eyes and shook his head slightly. I've heard that a lot. But you stayed quiet. You didn't bring the cameras. You didn't even want to give an opening speech. And most importantly, you got Frank back on his feet. You didn't just save this rundown garage. You saved a valuable person and the students who will follow in his footsteps. Jimmy met Eddie's gaze. I know a master, Eddie. In the gym and in the garage, Frank works with his soul, not his hands. I didn't want that soul to be lost. At that moment, Frank's voice was heard from inside. Jimmy, where are you hiding, son? The crowd turned around. Frank was waving his hand. Jimmy stepped forward, even though he didn't want to. Frank called him over to the podium and put his arm around Jimmy's shoulder. This guy, he said, turning to the crowd, came to me by chance to have his car repaired. But then he came back, not just to say thank you or give me a gift. He came with an idea. Most people would have left. Jimmy stayed. He didn't want to see this place close down, and he gave me my life back. At first, Jimmy didn't want to take the microphone, but all eyes were on him. He closed his eyes and took a short breath. Yes, it's true. I came here to get my car repaired, but I met a valuable craftsman, a man who quietly did his job to the best of his ability and with great care, but who did everything right. And I realized that when things are done right, they leave a mark, even if they don't make a sound. This center will repair not only cars, but also lives. The crowd began to applaud enthusiastically once again. Hours passed. After the official opening ceremony, the visitors toured the facility. There was new equipment, Frank's old trophies on the wall, young students' workshop tables, and even old newspaper clippings framed in a corner of the wall. Local Master Winnow 1978 Classic Mustang race. While Jimmy was drinking coffee with Sarah in the backyard, Frank had already started explaining to the young people how to adjust spark plug gaps. His fingers were moving slowly now, but his knowledge was still sharp. Sarah took a sip of her coffee. Jimmy, I thanked you, didn't I? Jimmy's eyes were fixed on Frank. He started talking about your father. He didn't do anything to be thanked. He just reminded me how to do good work, that some things still matter. Doing the right thing, producing with patience. And he reminded me of true mastery. Sarah smiled. It's not just a repair shop anymore. It's going to beat like the heart of this neighborhood again. And you started it. Jimmy stood up as the sun set. He took the car keys out of his pocket. This is just the beginning. A small spark is enough to keep the legacy alive. But now, it's our job to turn that spark into a fire. Sarah looked at his face. The Those words seemed to signal something more than just Frank's garage. "What does this mean to you?" she asked curiously. Jimmy looked into the distance. He spoke thoughtfully. "When I was growing up, there were no places like this. Even if there were, we didn't have the courage to go in, or anyone to guide us. But here, at the Morris Education Center, when children get their hands dirty, they're not just tightening screws, they're consciously shaping their lives." Sarah nodded. "And you're opening that path for those children." Jimmy took a deep breath. Sometimes the greatest investments aren't found in a printed logo or the number of cars you sell. The real investment is in believing in the potential of others. As the weeks went by, the impact of the Morris Automotive Training Center began to spread beyond the neighborhood. Local news channels did interviews, and social media posts reached hundreds of thousands of views. But perhaps the most striking thing was the enthusiasm for learning among the students at the center. Among the first group were a young man on the verge of being expelled from school, a child on the autism spectrum, and an adult with a criminal record. All of them had found a new sense of self at the education center, thanks to Frank's patience and Jimmy's vision. Frank was still one of the first to arrive every morning. He may not have been dismantling engines anymore, but he answered every question the young people asked with patience and with his eyes. The tremor in his hands was now less a sign of old age than a part of his desire to communicate. One day, when he was alone with Jimmy in a corner of the classroom, Frank said, "You know, when this idea was first mentioned, I was scared. Becoming a teacher at this age, it seemed very intimidating to me." Jimmy smiled slightly. "You were already a teacher, Frank. The only thing different is that now you're standing in front of a new classroom." Frank bowed his head. "One of the things that has affected me the most in this life was seeing a young and famous man, like you, realize that an old master is still valuable. It gave me a second life, son." Jimmy turned to him with a serious expression. "What can I say about what you gave me? It wasn't just a car, Frank. It was a different perspective. It showed me that there are still people in this world who value being honest and doing the right thing. You are one of those valuable people." Months later, when Jimmy Butler was a guest on a television show, he was asked, "Jimmy, what was the most meaningful thing you did for society outside of basketball?" Jimmy smiled, lowering his eyes for a moment. "In the back alleys of Miami, in a garage that was almost forgotten, there was a man who did his work not with his hands, but with his heart. Seeing him changed my life like a turning point. Maybe not the world, but it completely changed the youth and future of a neighborhood." Morris Automotive Training Center was no longer just a repair shop, but a community center. It was hope for young people, pride for masters, and a bridge for the community. And above the door, there was still that old sign, Morris Auto, faded but proud. Every time Jimmy passed by, he would stop for a moment, listen to the engine sounds, hear the laughter inside, and think to himself, this journey began with a broken-down car. But in the end, what was repaired was so much more. What about you? Have there been moments in your life when a small spark turned into a big change? Maybe a master, a teacher, or someone you never expected? Write it in the comments below, because the biggest changes sometimes start in the most ordinary places, and your story could inspire someone else. Remember, sometimes just a thank you can change the world.